Either we heal as a team, or we're going to crumble. Inch by inch, play by play, till we're finished. We're in hell right now, gentlemen, believe me. And we can stay here, get the shit kicked out of us, or we can fight our way back into the light. We can climb out of hell. 1 inch at a time. You know, when you get old in life, things get taken from you. I mean, that's part of life. But you only learn that when you start losing stuff. You find out life's this game of inches. So is football. Because in either game, life or football, the margin for error is so small. I mean, 1/2 a step too late or too early, and you don't quite make it. 1/2 second too slow, too fast, you don't quite catch it. The inches we need are everywhere around us. They're in every break of the game, every minute, every second. On this team, we fight for that inch. On this team, we tear ourselves and everyone else around us to pieces for that inch. We claw our fingernails for that inch. Because we know when we add up all those inches, that's going to make the fucking difference between winning and losing. Between living and dying. I'll tell you this, in any fight, it's the guy who's willing to die who's going to win that inch. And I know if I'm going to have any life anymore, it's because I'm still willing to fight and die for that inch. Because that's what living is. There's 6 inches in front of your face. Now, I can't make you do it. You got to look at the guy next to you. Look into his eyes. Now, I think you're going to see a guy who will go that inch with you. You're going to see a guy who will sacrifice himself for this team because he knows when it comes down to it, you're going to do the same for him. That's a team, gentlemen. And either we heal now as a team, or we will die as individuals.
Ideas are bulletproof.
Welcome to the show, ladies and gentlemen. It is December 28th, 2011. This is another live edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. I'm your host, Popeye from FederalJack.com. And today I have a special show planned for you all. I have a good friend of mine and frequent guest to the program here, back on, Professor Jim Fetzer. Jim, say hello.
Hey, Popeye.
And Jim's been kind enough to grace us with his knowledge this evening, even though he's a little under the weather. So everybody has to, give him a break for his sore throat. But Jim came on tonight because we're going to talk about 2 murders. One we've already talked about a little bit, but we're going to get back into it. And another one Jim just wrote an article about, which I reposted over on Federal Jack. And it's gone viral off of my site, and I'm sure the original that he posted on Veterans Today is probably gone viral as well. And it's about the murder of Corporal Pat Tillman. Jim, what do you want to get into first? Do you want to discuss Paul Wellstone, or do you want to discuss Tillman and then show how that dovetails into Wellstone?
Well, Popeye, the principles of reasoning are the same, so that might be the place to begin. It's the basic principle of scientific reasoning that enables you to sort these things out is called inference to the best explanation. So what you're doing when you compare alternative hypotheses, in this case we're talking about whether Pat Tillman was killed by accident during a firefight or whether he may have been deliberately assassinated. And what you want to look at is all of the evidence and ask, well, which is more probable for all that evidence to be the case? That he was assassinated or that it was a firefight. I mean, let me mention just a couple of key points here. No evidence of enemy fire at the scene has ever been produced. The lieutenant general who withheld details of Tillman's death from his parents for months told investigators that he had a bad memory, couldn't remember details of his actions on more than 70 occasions. According to the Washington Post on May 4, 2005, the Army's own investigators were aware that Tillman had been killed by being shot 3 times in the head. Senior Army commanders, including General John Abizaid, knew of this fact within days of the shooting, but nevertheless approved him for the Silver Star, the Purple Heart, and a posthumous promotion. Army doctors told the investigators that these tightly grouped wounds suggested murder and urged them to launch a criminal investigation, which would not be pursued. And Army attorneys congratulated each other in emails for impeding any criminal investigation, as they concluded that Tillman's death was a result of friendly fire and that only administrative or non-criminal punishment was indicated, and indeed, no one was ever punished for this case. Now, compare this to a very simple illustration of what I'm talking about. Suppose you find a body, and it has no knife wounds and no gunshot wounds, but it has, say, some bruising around the neck. Then if you're a detective investigating the case, you might consider whether the deceased was shot or was stabbed or was strangled. Well, since there was no bullet wounds in the body, the probability that this person was shot is approximately 0. Similarly, since there are no knife wounds in the body, the probability that he was killed by being stabbed is also approximately 0. But given abrasions around the throat, the probability that he might have been strangled would be considerably higher. Now, that means at that point that what's known as the likelihood or measure of evidential support, which is based on those probabilities, provides stronger support for the hypothesis that the decedent was strangled than that he was shot or that he was stabbed. Now, that makes it what is known as the preferable hypothesis. It's like having a strongest suspect in a murder case based upon the then available evidence. Now,
well, when we apply that to Pat Tillman's death, it doesn't point towards blue on blue friendly fire at all, does it?
It doesn't. No, it doesn't. So I ask, see, this is what I ask further on down. I say, here we compare H1 that it was an accident and H2 that it was not, as follows. H1, if Tillman had been killed accidentally, even by friendly fire, then what is the probability that no evidence of a bona fide firefight would be produced, that the lieutenant general would suffer 70 memory lapses, that the corporal would have been shot 3 times in the head, that honors would be bestowed upon him, that the doctors would have suspected he was murdered, and that Army attorneys would impede criminal investigations? The likelihood of this evidence, given that it was an accident, would have been very low. But H2, if Tillman had been killed intentionally using friendly fire as the cover story, then what's the probability that no evidence of a bona fide firefight would be produced, that the lieutenant general would suffer 70 memory lapses, that the corporal would have been shot 3 times in the head, that honors would be bestowed upon him, that the doctors would have suspected he was murdered, and that Army attorneys would impede criminal investigations? The likelihood of this evidence, given it was intentional, would have been very high. So you don't actually have to be a rocket scientist to realize something is wrong here, that the Army's claim is preposterous on its face.
Yeah, and McChrystal, he got pretty much outed for lying about the whole thing, and he still didn't get in any trouble. I mean, getting fired by Obama was a complete different thing. That was over a separate issue that had nothing to do with the Tillman incident.
That's right. My impression is that McChrystal was actually fairly enthusiastic about assassinations and other forms of subversive warfare. So, this was really bad. And I believe, as I explain in the article to which you make reference, that Pat Tillman committed a colossal mistake he couldn't possibly have realized at the time. But a friend arranged for him to go to visit Noam Chomsky, who, of course, many on the left regard as something of an idol, if not a living god. And that Chomsky, see, by confiding in Chomsky, he was disillusioned with the war, and that he wanted to become an anti-war activist when he returned, would have been a good thing if Chomsky was on the up and up. My suspicion, however, based upon my experience with him, and what I know about him in relation to JFK on the one hand and 9/11 on the other, is that while Chomsky is very good at the intermediate level issues, that ultimately don't make a great deal of difference when it comes to the big ticket issues. Whether JFK's assassination involved a conspiracy, high-level government officials, whether 9/11 was a fabricated event involving Bush, Cheney, neocons, and the Mossad. He's an utter failure. He's an utter failure, Popeye.
I agree. I agree, Jim. We're going to get cut off by the break. But I agree with what you're saying. From what I've researched on Chomsky, he's not on the up and up. And there's a lot of other people that have said the same thing. So you're not alone. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be right back. Stay tuned. More on the murder of Corporal Pat Tillman. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back. This is my friend LMS. You guys should check him out. He's on iTunes. Good guy. Founding member of Federal Jack. He's supported me for a long, long time. Really good guy, good friend of mine. Giving you a shout out, L. All right, anyway, getting back into it. Jim and I were talking about, Pat Tillman and going into the break, and we were discussing, Jim was breaking down scientific method and everything, and once you look at it using certain principles and you look at the Tillman murder, using the scientific method, you realize that the probability of, an accidental shooting is, and then all these things covering it up afterwards is just, a bazillion to one. And, Jim, I find that that's usually how they get caught, is not even so much in pulling the act off, because obviously they've thought about the act itself and many times figured out ways to cover it and make, things confusing, the act itself. But it's the cover-up that they do afterwards that sticks out like a sore thumb.
Well, it depends. Yeah, it depends how much time and effort is devoted to designing it. In the case of JFK, that doesn't have much thought put into it. The Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, that doesn't have much thought. But the 9/11 and JFK, they have more thought put into it. So you're right. It depends on the amount of time they have. If they just have time to slap something together, or if they actually have time to rehearse it. Yeah. But I find that cover-up or the investigation they're-into, you know what I mean? Because there always has to be, when something happens, you wait to see their reaction. Look at the BP oil spill. If anybody wants to think, if you don't think that the oil spill was created or done as a criminal act, the response to it was certainly criminal. So obviously something is there. You know what I mean? If they really gave a crap, they wouldn't have reacted that way. So I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead, Jim. The floor is yours. Oh, no. Actually, I was going to agree with you that in particular it's unpacking the cover-up that provides the greatest evidence as to who was responsible. I mean, in the case of JFK, for example, we discovered that the autopsy x-rays had been altered to conceal a massive blowout to the back of the head, which had been fired by a shot from the right front. That once they patched up that hole in the back of the head, there was nowhere for his brains to have gone. So even though he had a third to a half of his brains blown out in Dealey Plaza, they substituted someone else's brain for his, which you can find in diagrams and photographs in the National Archives, which led a world authority on the human brain, Bob Livingston, to recognize that this couldn't possibly be JFK's brains, because so many physicians at Parkland Hospital had talked about cerebellar as well as cerebral tissue extruding from the fist-sized hole at the back of his head, where the cerebellum is a compact part of the brain at the base of the skull, which he, by the way, believed could not have been dislodged even by two near simultaneous shots, one to the back of his head and the other that entered his right temple, which was a frangible or exploding bullet, unless this tough membrane that covers the cerebellum, called the tentorium, had itself been ruptured, which led him to infer that the bullet that hit Jack in the throat had hit bone and split, part of it gone down into the right lung, the other upward to sever the tentorium, so that there would be the possibility of cerebellum extruding from the near simultaneous impact of those other two shots. And then third, of course, that the home movie of the assassination, in fact, all of them, the three or four key ones that show the most important elements of the assassination, have been altered to take out, in particular, a limo stop. The driver, William Greer, pulled the limousine to the left and to a halt to make sure Jack would be killed, and it was during that, say, 3-second approximately interval that he was hit twice in the head, fell forward. Jack eased him back up and was looking at him right in the face when he was hit by a frangible or exploding bullet in the right temple that set up shock waves that blew his brains out the back of his head so hard that the motorcycle patrolman to the left rear, Bobby Hargis, impacted with that debris, thought he himself had been shot, and where a triangular chunk of the back of Jack's head was found in the grass the next day. Now, you have to ask, who would have the power to do that?
Jackie was going after, right? A lot of people thought that she was climbing out of the back of the limo. That's not what she was doing. She was trying to recover a piece of the back of Jack's skull that was sitting on the trunk.
That's right.
She even said it. She said she was going to get a piece of his head.
That's right, and she held it in her hand all the way to Parkland Hospital, and then after they pried JFK out of her arms, she came into trauma room number 1 and walked over to Pepper Jenkins, the anesthesiologist, extending her hand with this chunk of Jack's skull and brains, asking, will this help? Which has to be the most poignant moment in the entire history of the assassination. I mean, Jackie knew a lot about culture, art, music, literature. She didn't know anything about ballistics, wounds, brain surgery, and all that. I mean, in fact, the mortician observed that JFK's face showed no discoloration, which meant he died instantly in Dealey Plaza. So the whole thing about...
I'm willing to bet he was dead as soon as his brains went out the back of his head. He was disconnected.
That's a pretty good inference to draw upon. Yeah. The whole thing was a charade, to respect his religion as a Roman Catholic. They wanted a priest to have the time to come in and perform last rites, but it was just a facade.
So is it respectful of religion to carve someone's skull open after they're dead to alter wounds? No, I don't think so.
It's interesting you mention that, because most of the world has no idea that actually even after the body got to Bethesda Naval Hospital, after the Secret Service forcibly removed it from the only jurisdiction that had legal authority, because it was the crime was a murder. There were no federal laws.
Yeah, there was a shoving match inside in the hospital, apparently, with the mortician workers and stuff, and they said that there was a shoving match with the Secret Service and the FBI.
Well, the Secret Service stole the body, and they hustled it out on one or the other of the planes, and then it was secretly removed from the coffin. And when at Andrews Air Force Base, it was transferred to a helicopter and taken to Walter Reed, where the body was examined to remove bullet fragments, the key being that the assassins at these different locations, and there appear to have been 6, who fired a total of 8, 9, or 10 bullets, would have been using their own preferred weapon, Popeye, and they wouldn't all have had the same caliber. I mean, some of the shots were fired with Mandicker Carcanos, in particular 3 from the Dowtex. One that missed and injured a distant bystander by the name of James Tague, one that missed and hit a chrome strip over the limousine windshield, and the third that hit Jack in the back of the head, all appear to have been fired from the Dowtex. There was a closet for a uranium mining company. It was a CIA front where I believe an anti-Castro Cuban by the name of Nestor Tony Hiscadero fired 3 shots with an unsilenced Mannlicher Carcano, which I believe was the only unsilenced weapon.
Anybody will tell you that if you're going to shoot, any real sniper is not going to sit next to an open window with a rifle and pull the rifle out of the window. He's going to figure out how he can sit back into the room at least 6 to 12 feet and still have his shot. Because sitting in the room gives him more cover as opposed to shooting from hanging out of an outside window,
Oh, yeah. The official story about the 6th floor is simply ludicrous.
And unless Oswald was hanging by his feet like a monkey so he could swing over about 8 feet to the left, there's no way he was going to hit Kennedy the way Kennedy was hit from the position he was at, okay?
Oh, it's all preposterous, Popeye. You're absolutely right.
It's a crossfire. They put him right in a crossfire, Jim. Actually, it was a triangulation of fire. I don't even want to say a crossfire. It was a triangulation of fire from 3 points.
Well, actually, there were shooters at 6 locations, so it was like a double triangulation. He was hit in the back by a shot fired from the top of the county records building.
Why would it be 6? Or why would it be 3? You see? It always plays off that this affinity these sick pricks have for, numerology and whatever power they believe that these numbers have. That's where this belief and all this, oh, you think it's such and such a day. Because he's tricks push this kind of stuff. And going on for years. I just thought it was an interesting fact. But 3 does make sense for a crossfire militarily, too. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get cut off by the break. Stay tuned. I promise we'll get into it. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a reason Jim and I were talking about the JFK assassination, and we had to bring up certain points because we were discussing Noam Chomsky. And rather than just accuse somebody of something or throwing a name out there and then continuing on, we'd rather you kind of have at least some perspective as to why people think the way they do of Chomsky. And I'm not talking about the people that, he has like a cult-like following. I mean, that just explains it right there. I'm talking about the people that say they don't trust Chomsky. And Jim and I were discussing JFK and just some of the absurdities with it because Chomsky, he doesn't believe that there was a conspiracy. He believes Oswald killed Kennedy, doesn't he?
Well, he says, actually, that it doesn't matter. And what he says, the reason he explains it doesn't matter is because even if there were or had been a conspiracy, which only requires 2 or more individuals acting together to bring about an illegal ends. That it didn't involve any major policy issues, and therefore it's insignificant. He actually shrugs his shoulder and says, who cares? But Jack was planning to pull us out of Vietnam. He hadn't invaded Cuba against the recommendation of the Joint Chiefs. He'd gone ahead and signed an above-ground test ban treaty against their opposition. Bobby was cracking down on organized crime. Jack had already instructed the Department of the Treasury to print United States notes and was planning to abolish or reform the Fed. He was contemplating dismantling the CIA, or at the very least reducing it to its originally intended purely intelligence gathering function. I mean, these are huge issues. He was also planning to cut the oil depletion allowance, this huge tax write-off given to oilmen on the presumptive ground that they're pumping a finite resource out of the earth, and therefore when they pump oil out, they're putting themselves out of business, which is something they've used. It's a rather flimsy argument, but they used to get a huge tax write-off. Jack was going to end that. In fact, Lyndon Johnson, on New Year's Eve after the assassination, when he was confronted with rumors by his longtime mistress, Madeline Duncan Brown, by whom he had a son, Stephen, born in 1950, not his only child out of wedlock, but his only male offspring, when she confronted Lyndon at the Driscoll Hotel on New Year's Eve, 6 weeks after the assassination, that he might have been involved since no one stood to gain more personally. He blew up at her and told her the CIA and the oil boys had decided that Jack had to be taken out. Now, Lyndon did a great deal to facilitate it. He sent his chief administrative assistant, Cliff Carter, for example, down to Dallas to make sure all the arrangements were in place. Lyndon was a very hands-on kind of guy. In fact, it appears that he manipulated his way onto the ticket after Jack had already decided he was going to run with Stuart Symington and had extended to him an invitation. But Lyndon, when Bobby came to make a pro forma invitation, which they were sure he would decline since he had so much power as a majority leader in the Senate and would have very little as a vice president, he instead grabbed it and, I believe, using information provided by J. Edgar about Jack's liaisons, which included one with a very beautiful East German woman who turned out to be a spy, and the fact that he had Addison's disease, which meant he wasn't going to live a long, healthy life, and also threatened that if he were not put on the ticket, then he would bottle up any legislation that the White House sent to the Congress. They found themselves in the position of having to relinquish and put LBJ on the ticket, and Jack had to apologize profusely to Stuart Symington. But, Lyndon would explain later that he had studied American presidential history and discovered 1 out of 4 presidents didn't survive their term, and that he was a gambling man. But the fact of the matter is Lyndon was not a gambling man. He only bet on sure things. And he took the position with a plan, the anticipation that they would assassinate Jack so he could accede to the presidency. In the TV age, he was not a charismatic guy. He was actually kind of an ugly dude. He was big, but he was ugly. He was, however, profoundly politically skilled and could read the weaknesses of men effortlessly, it seemed, and was able to manipulate one after another. So he was really quite a fascinating character. By the way, what Madeline concluded about Lyndon, namely his profound involvement, was confirmed by Billy Saul Estes, a Texas wheeler dealer who made Lyndon and Connally a lot of money on cons in his book, Texas Legend. Further confirmed by Bar McClellan in his book Blood, Money, Power, where he explained that the attorney for whom he worked, whose name was Clark, had been involved in helping to plan the assassination. And, of course, when E. Howard Hunt gave his last confession, which was published in Rolling Stone, he listed off the chain of command for the assassination, beginning with Lyndon Johnson and then Cord Meyer, who was running covert ops for the CIA at that point in time, David Atlee Phillips, who was in charge of CIA Western Hemisphere, William
and
Harvey.
Judith, I have to cut you off for a second. Judith was told by Oswald the last time they talked that if ever she was to remember one person's name, it would be David Atlee Phillips.
Well, that's very interesting. That's very interesting.
And he was the guy that was Oswald's handler. That was the name of his handler. So very interesting that you bring him up.
Well, yes, and you know, I think E. Howard Hunt was speaking the truth, although he's sometimes been thought to have been the third of the three tramps. That's not the case. The third of the three tramps was a CIA contract agent by the name of Chauncey Marvin Holt, whom I got to know personally, who prepared the forged 15 sets of forged Secret Service credentials for use in and around Dealey Plaza. Now, what's important about all this is that Chomsky is issuing a blanket denial of the significance, even if there had been a conspiracy in the assassination of JFK, because there were no policy issues involved. But that's provably false. No historian would agree with Chomsky on that. So he's clearly dissembling, fabricating, faking it, lying to the American people in order to dismiss that, you know, the assassination occurred, it was a conspiracy, it involved high-level individuals. I mean, ask yourself, could the mafia, for example, have extended its reach into Bethesda Naval Hospital to alter X-rays under the control of medical officers of the United States Navy, agents of the Secret Service, or the president's personal physician? Or could anti-Castro Cubans, for example, been able to substitute someone else's brain for that of JFK? Or could the KGB, for example, which might have had an ability comparable to Hollywood or the CIA to fake films, have been able to get its hands on the Zapruder? And the answer, of course, is resoundingly no.
Well, it's like Kevin Costner said when he was playing Garrison in the movie, when the one guy kept saying it was the mafia, and he said, "Come on, you know, could the mafia cover this up? Could the mafia cover this up? Could they change the motorcade route? Could they do this? Could they do that?"
That's
no,
right.
they couldn't.
That's right.
There's only one person or one group of individuals that could have done that, and that would be Jack's own handlers. So it would have to be, by definition, a conspiracy of the inside job variety.
Did you mean Lee's handlers rather than Jack's? We have more than 15 indications of Secret Service complicity in setting him up for the hit, by the way. I mean, it just
that's
goes
what I'm saying.
On
that's what I meant by his handlers. Well, meaning I was being sarcastic.
Oh, the
about
Secret
Jack.
Service. Yeah. On the job.
Well, you saw the video, right, where the one guy, he waves off, and right as they turn onto Elm Street, they wave off the guys that were on the back, which would have been the human shields. And
two agents were actually left back at Love Field, Popeye. And then all the vehicles were in the wrong order. The presidential limousine should have been in the middle. There should have been a flatbed truck in front of it.
Yeah, so basically, there's just there's a ton of evidence to support the fact there obviously was a conspiracy, and the government itself, even though that was a whitewash, the subcommittee on assassinations there. Even though that was a whitewash, they admitted that there was enough evidence that there was a conspiracy to take out Kennedy, and it wasn't just some lone gunman thing. So,
the HSCA did reinvestigate, and there were some very peculiar features of that, especially with the medical panel.
Because a lot of that was a whitewash in itself. Well,
I started to talk about this in the beginning, Popeye, that Jack had this fist-sized blowout in the back of his head, which physicians at Parkland and Clint Hill observed when he climbed up on the back of the limo, pushed Jackie down, lay across the bodies, peered down into this gaping hole in the back of Jack's head. and then turned to his colleagues and gave him a thumbs down, which he's been saying for 47 years he did before the limo got to the triple underpass, which means all of that was taken out.
So they already knew that he was dead before they even got to the underpass.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so they're not dumb. Obviously they're trained, and these guys are usually prior military, so that have seen, you have to be, combat vet, blah, blah, blah. So a lot of these guys, they already know. So the evidence is just mounts, ladies and gentlemen. So the point is, Chomsky is obviously being a shill for somebody. We're going to break. We'll be right back. All right, ladies and gentlemen. So you can see that there was a mountain of evidence without even getting, that far into it. You can stay in the shallow. You can just dip your toe in the shallow end of the pool that is the JFK assassination, and you see that there's just tons and tons of evidence. So obviously, if Chomsky says it doesn't matter, blah, 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 you can see he's just, he's doing that because he knows many people will listen to him, and many people will be like, you know what, he's right. There's other more important things to worry about. So the fact that Chomsky could be a shill for the CIA or connected to them somehow is not that very far off, too. You were talking about during the break, Jim.
Well, my understanding is that the MIT was actually founded by the CIA.
That came out.
And, of course, Chomsky is a longtime faculty member at MIT. But the fact of the matter is what he says is ridiculous on its face. Lenin observed that the best way to control the opposition is to lead it. And Chomsky has long been regarded as a leader of the left or as a gatekeeper, as one who, keeps all the sheep in line, conforming to whatever beliefs he and the agency believe are most beneficial to their interests, which are far removed from truth, justice, and the American way, may I say. And he's been equally dismissive about 9/11, saying really in this kind of sarcastic way, well, he thinks it's very unlikely that the government had anything to do with 9/11. But that's just silly. I mean, once you look at the evidence, you realize the whole thing is a house of cards. Just to offer one stunning illustration, everyone's seen video of the Twin Towers allegedly collapsing, except it would have been impossible for them to collapse. The fires didn't burn long enough or hot enough to cause the steel to weaken, much less melt. Below the 96th floor in the North Tower and the 80th floor in the South, those buildings were stone-cold steel. The steel was tapered from the sub-basement where it was about 6 inches thick up to the top where it was about a quarter-inch thick, so that Chuck Baldwin, who's a retired high school physics and chemistry instructor, has calculated that the mass of steel at that top portion, top 14 floors or so of the North Tower, represented only 1.4% of the mass of the steel, and the idea that that tiny percentage could overcome the lower 98.6 is simply absurd. But here's an even simpler argument. According to the government, those buildings came down, which they didn't actually do. They actually blew apart. But they came down because of the combined effects of the airplane crashes, the fires, and gravity, bringing about a collapse. But gravity operates in only one direction, downward. I mean, look at Building 7. Building 7 was coming down in a classic controlled demolition under the control of gravity after all the support columns had been blown out. And you notice it just comes straight down. It doesn't blow apart in every direction. Contrast that with the Twin Towers. They're blowing apart in every direction. Well, that can't possibly be an effect of gravity. That's an effect of explosives. Explosives blow things in every direction. Gravity does not. So all you have to do is look at the gross observable evidence for the Twin Towers, and you can tell that the government has been lying through its teeth by claiming this was a gravity-driven collapse, which wasn't even physically possible under the circumstances as I've explained. Indeed, if the fires, which were asymmetrically distributed, had burned hot enough or long enough to cause the steel to weaken, which it manifestly did not, and because that was a huge, intricate lattice steel structure, it was an enormous heat sink that would draw heat away from building up in any particular location. If that had happened, which it did not, then you would have had some sagging, some gradual tilting of parts of the building, you wouldn't have had any massive, complete, and abrupt collapse. So the government has been lying to us from the beginning. And anyone can tell. Just look at that and ask, well, since gravity only works in one direction, how can those buildings be blowing apart and from the top down where every floor is remaining stationary, waiting its turn to be blown to kingdom come? And when it's all over, Popeye, there's no massive stack of pancakes. There's no massive stack of floors. In fact, if you go to new 9/11 photos released on my personal blog at jamesfetzer.blogspot.com, you can see a sequence of photographs showing the destruction of the North Tower, and then I have a video there showing that after the destruction was done, and it's not a collapse, but it is a destruction, the part of the core columns of the North Tower remain standing, and you can actually see them turn to dust before your very eyes. Now, this shouldn't be surprising, because if the whole building is being turned to dust before our very eyes and it's being converted into millions of cubic yards of very fine dust, then, of course, the parts of the building are also being converted into dust. So there's no reason why it shouldn't be the case that some of the footage would show, say, that remnant of the North Tower core columns turning to dust. You can see it before your very eyes.
I agree, and if you use the scientific method and you apply it, and you look at the evidence, you let the evidence lead you where it may. Now, again, 9/11 is another issue that, he kind of,
yeah, he poo-poos, trivializes, minimizes.
Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. Poo-poos. I couldn't think of that word. He kind of, Chomsky
that's a technical term.
But that's the exact term I was looking for. He kind of poo-poos it, like, oh, whatever, it's not that important. And again, you have to ask yourself, why? How does he benefit from that? And obviously he would have to personally benefit some way.
Well, my opinion is that he's an operative. I mentioned over the break there, I believe it was the church committee that discovered there were some 3,000 faculty distributed around the country who were working for the CIA. And, of course, Carl Bernstein in 1977 published an article in Rolling Stone entitled "The CIA and the Media," in which he revealed that high officials of the agency boasted that their greatest successes had been with Time Life, CBS, and the New York Times. And before he died, William Colby, perhaps inadvisedly, observed that the CIA owns everyone of significance in the major media. Well, you got to take that at face value. I mean, Colby knew what he was talking about. And when it corroborates what we get from Carl Bernstein, it explains why otherwise usually responsible newspapers like the New York Times have suffocated findings about the assassination of JFK that prove the existence of a conspiracy that has been unwilling completely to address any significant question about 9/11. And you realize, well, even the New York Times, which happens to be our nation's newspaper of record, which means it keeps what is supposed to be the official history of the United States, is a shill for the CIA. There's just no doubt about it. You cannot study the history of the New York Times and not arrive at that conclusion. It's very, very sad. But today you can get more truth from Russia Today or Pravda or Press TV, which is the Iranian news outlet, than you can from the New York Times. I mean, it's very sad.
Pretty sad. That is pretty sad. You get less propaganda from foreign news agencies than you do from our own.
Popeye foreigners, those who live abroad, understand these issues far better than the American people. The American people are the most ignorant because their press is so massively controlled.
Yeah, and of course the educational system teaches them to be,
you got local school boards control what textbooks are used in the high schools, for example. And anything that's controversial is going to be cut out, so you get the lowest common denominator. You get the most pedestrian account of any of these events.
Of course. Talking about JFK, I ran into a young lady a couple years ago. She was the hostess at a restaurant that I used to frequent. And she was probably about, I think she was maybe just like almost 19 at the time. And she had just graduated high school the summer before. And I was talking to her, and I was giving out DVDs because the staff knew me. And I used to give out DVDs every time I was there. So every time I came in, they would always come over and ask me for more movies if I had anything new. And, of course, they were all, documentaries, about what's going on. So I was talking to them about JFK, And she said to me, she said the most startling thing to me. She looked at me, and she was 100% dead serious. She said, JFK was shot? With this quizzical look on her face. And I said, you're kidding, right? You're just screwing around? And she goes, no. And I said, what do you mean, no? Didn't they teach you in high school that he had his head blown off in the middle of Dealey Plaza? She said, no. They taught us that he died when he was in office. And I almost fell over. I was like, are you kidding me? She's like, no. They taught us that he died while he was in office, and then Johnson took over. There was like maybe like 2 pages dedicated to it.
It's of course true that he died while in office, but that is somehow
they kind of left out the reason.
Kind of left it out. That's stunning, Popeye.
Never mind that bullet that hit him in the forehead, Jim. Ignore that.
With a brain in her head?
He died of lead poisoning, apparently. I don't know. I mean,
yes, lead poisoning.
It was ridiculous. But when she said that, yes, I was blown away. I was just like, they're teaching you that I guess you're right. It is kind of true. He did die in office. I'm doing air quotes as I say that. So, see, they're dumbing America down. So they don't know to ask these questions. They don't know people, they buy the hero story of poor Pat Tillman.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Do you ever see, there's a documentary that was put out by Sony Pictures, I think with his family, but the documentary, it touches on things, but I don't think it goes deep enough. So we'll get more into that in hour 2. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to break. We're back in a few minutes. Stay tuned. Jim and I will be back in about 5 minutes with hour number 2. Now that we've set you up and you understand why we call Chomsky a dirtbag and why we say he's connected to the CIA, we can get back to why poor Pat made the mistake of calling Chomsky and letting meeting with him. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with hour number 2 of tonight's edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. It is December 28th, 2011. I am your humble host, Popeye from FederalJack.com. Tonight I'm joined by my guest, friend, and fellow researcher, Professor Jim Fetzer. And we're discussing the murder of Pat Tillman. In the first hour, we had to get into explaining why Pat talking to Noam Chomsky was probably one of the biggest things that did him in, or the thing that did him in, and led to his demise, his trust in Chomsky. And rather than just make some bland accusation without giving any explanation as to why, Jim and I decided to take the scenic route, and because that's how we are, that's how we roll. Now you have a better understanding of, a brief understanding of why we said what we said about Chomsky and how he's connected and everything else with the CIA. So he's obviously a shill or a lackey, whatever you want to call them, for the Central Intelligence Agency, or actually I should call it the Cocaine Importing Agency. And obviously Tillman going to him was just a very bad thing. Before we get into back into Pat, there's a side note I want to throw out there before I forget. I saw this earlier right before I came on air, and I made a note to Jim, and I tried to find a video of it to play like audio of for the listeners, but apparently no news agency has covered this at all yet, like video-wise, and only a tiny little blurb I found on CNN. But Chavez, on BBC there's an article too. There was one on Fox News, but they took it off. And apparently Chavez came out and said that he thinks that the U.S. is using some form of weaponized cancer to take out Central and South American leaders because there's too many of them getting cancer. And the probability of it, when you sit down and actually do the math, is just unbelievable. And he really thinks that, and who knows, maybe he's heard my interviews with Judith Very Baker about how they created weaponized cancer to kill Castro. And we did a whole special on weaponized cancer, so who knows? But I thought that'd be interesting for you and the listeners to hear really quick before we got back into Pat.
Also, Popeye, for the reason that Jack Ruby believed he'd been injected with this rapid-acting cancer.
Very good point. He said the same thing.
And he also observed that if someone else had been vice president, that this would not have happened, meaning the assassin.
Yeah, he said if Adlai Stevenson was the vice president, that none of this would have happened. And then they said, I remember this. There's a video of it on YouTube, and the reporter said, "Could you could you like expand on that basically? And Jack says the answer is the man in office now.
That's right.
So he was pointing right to Johnson, and he did say that he felt he was injected with cancer, and 28 days after he was injected was when he died, and that was the form that they had with Judith that she had created in the lab with Mary Sherman and David Ferry and whoever else, whatever other doctors were involved in the back end. Yeah, Oswald helped out. She's pretty much the person that taught them how, because they were trying to work on it already, and she was the key that fit in the lock. You know what I mean? And they used her as like they always do. But in the interview I did with her, where we did specifically, we covered cancer as a bioweapon. I asked her if she felt, and I mentioned Chavez, and I said, "Do you think that they're using it?" And she said, "Well, I don't know, where it is. I'd have to, and she said this the first time, I'd have to look at it under a microscope, but, if I had to make an educated guess, yes. They're, and obviously it's been 48 years, so God knows what they've come up with in 48 years, Jim."
Yeah. And just to clarify about Chomsky, it's not that he's come out and admitted that he's working for the CIA. It's just that
No. Jim had to break that down. Sorry.
When you put all the evidence together, it's the most probable explanation for his behavior. I can't think of anything that is even remotely close. That he's controlling the opposition by leading it in accordance with Lenin's maxim.
I agree, and I don't. There's from day one, Chomsky. There's always a red flag with him. You know what I mean? He just didn't something. You know how sometimes you get that sense about people, Jim, and you just.
Well, I know people who adore him, including my co-author on the book American Assassination: The Strange Death of Senator Paul Wellstone, Don Four Arrows Jacobs. When I began writing about Chomsky and how he was belittling the significance of a conspiracy in the assassination of JFK, Four Arrows was very upset. He actually wanted me to constrain how much I wrote about him. I still have a couple of pages in there. But, it was very clear to me that Chomsky is not on the up and up based upon my reasoning, given the available evidence. And I'm even stronger. I believe that more strongly today than I did then. But he had contacted me. This fellow was a Native American scholar from Northern Arizona University, and offered to collaborate with me if I wanted to do a book on the death of Paul Wellstone. I'd already published 10 articles in the local alternative press about it. And in fact, after I published my first, I was featured on Coast to Coast with Ian Punnett sitting in. He's from St. Paul. And I think he wanted to poke holes in what I was suggesting about Wellstone, but I already knew the case so well that he was unable to do that. So I've continued my research, not only with Four Arrows in publishing the book, which was announced at the National Press Club 2 years to the day of the crash. And then I flew this brilliant guy up from Australia who's got a PhD in electromagnetism by the name of John Costello, with whom I had discussed the possibility of some kind of high-tech weapon having been used here. And he and I were tramping around in the snow in 35 below zero weather, picking up pieces of the wreckage, which we would then take to a professor of chemistry emeritus at the University of Minnesota, Duluth, Ron Caples, who confirmed that there's no way that this was from the fuel in the plane, that this required an incredibly intense fire to melt these pieces of metal together. And, of course, that was one of the most peculiar aspects of the entire event, namely that the fuselage burned intensely for 7 hours and reduced the contents of the fuselage, including the senator, his wife, his daughter, 3 aides, and the 2 pilots, to charcoal, basically, Popeye. And it's very odd because the wings were broken off, and the wings are the area where the fuel is stored. The tail was broken off.
Jim, give the name of your book out on it, because we couldn't have enough time, in a 2-hour show to cover all the evidence that's in the book, because I didn't know really much about Wellstone's murder until I read your book. And then because I had investigated a little bit, but after I read your book cover to cover, and then I went and I read all your source material, and my jaw was just on the ground by the time I was done, because I was like, how did nobody else pick this up? Like, the national media had to have blatantly ignored it.
Right. Yeah. They didn't want to pursue it. And, of course, I mean, there's my most recent work on both of these topics are distilled in articles on Veterans Today. So you can find the assassination of Corporal Pat Tillman, USA, on Veterans Today, and you can find Senator Paul Wellstone, More Proof of Assassination, also on Veterans Today. If you just go to Veterans Today, Jim Fetzer, then you'll find a list of, I don't know, I have a couple of dozen articles there, maybe approaching 30 now. And you can pick and choose. There's quite a lot about 9/11.
Tell me the name of your book about Wellstone, too.
Yeah, actually, I did mention it in passing. It's entitled American Assassination, The Strange Death of Senator Paul Wellstone. But it's very difficult to come by. If you can get even a used copy, just snap it up, because, that book is becoming increasingly difficult.
I found a copy on Amazon
good.
A year ago.
That's very good.
I'm telling you, when I not only did I read your book, but I went through the evidence, and it was just incredible.
Yeah, I like that. That's
how did I
impressive.
never hear of this? The first thing I said to myself was, how did I never know about this?
What did William Colby tell us? That the CIA owns everyone of significance in the mass media. You got to realize he was speaking the truth.
And then he died of a kayaking accident in his backyard.
Yeah. Yes. He might have spoken a little too much of the truth.
Yeah, loose lips sink ships, Jim. You worked for the Department of the Navy for a little while. You know what I'm talking about. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to break. Stay tuned. Jim and I will be right back in 3 minutes. All right, so you're going to ask me, Popeye, how does Senator Paul Wellstone dovetail with Pat Tillman? Well, first,
I'm going to ask you that.
Well, not you. The listeners would ask me that.
Yeah, sure.
And that's why I would have. That's why I had Professor Fetzer come on tonight, because he's going to explain how it dovetails. Okay, and I'll give you one little hint. It involves Dick Cheney's assassination ring. Remember that assassination ring that Cy Hirsch talked about? Remember that? I know you know what I'm talking about, Jim.
Yeah, sure, of course.
So you obviously, yes. I mean, you're no fool. You know Cy Hirsch, and you've heard him talk about you know who he is, and you've heard him talk about the Cheney's assassination ring. Well, Cheney threatened Wellstone. So do you think, in the evidence that you've seen, and again, I urge people to go research the assassination, and I'm going to have Jim give you some places to check out information on Pat Tillman, and I'm going to give Jim the floor here in a sec. But the murder itself, if you could, after you pontificate and you tie everything together here, if you could throw out any details that you know that people should check into and places they can check into it, that would be lovely, Jim. The floor is yours.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, my first article discussing these cases, Wellstone and Tillman, was on Op-Ed News entitled, Has Cheney Been Murdering Americans? And I began with the revelation from Seymour Hersh that Cheney had been running an executive assassination ring out of his office in the West Wing, which is quite disgusting all by itself. But when you get deeply into either of these cases, you realize they're deliberate killings. I mean, and again, the probability, it's a probability of a tight group and during a firefight, practically zero. Tillman appears to have been shot from maybe 10 yards or less away. I mean, it's completely ridiculous to think this was part of a firefight. He was even calling out at the time that he was Pat effing Tillman, to his comrades, so they would stop shooting at him. But it appears that somebody was slipped into this op, which was a funny thing. It was in a valley that was controlled by the Taliban or the Al-Qaeda, allegedly. And yet the platoon commander divided his platoon into two groups, and this appears to have been not by his choice, but he was ordered to do it. And it appears to have been so he could set up a situation where you might have something that could qualify or be described as a firefight take place where one part of the platoon fires at the other. But it's pretty obvious everyone knew where Pat was. He was calling out and letting everyone know because he thought that this was ridiculous. He was being fired at. And nevertheless, he was taken out. And it all seems quite deliberate when you look at the evidence. Now, the case of Wellstone is very interesting in all sorts of ways, too, especially given that the NTSB only considered accident-compatible hypotheses. In other words, it turns out, and this is going to floor most members of the audience who don't already know this, but the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, has a policy that cannot investigate any crash scene as a crime scene unless the Attorney General declares it to be one. So if you have a complicit or compliant Attorney General, you got the perfect scenario for taking out your political enemies, bring them down in a plane crash, and then simply have the Attorney General decline to declare it a crash scene, and it cannot be investigated as a crime
And if it gets
scene.
investigated as a crime scene, guess who does the investigation, Jim?
Well, the FBI would do that, and the FBI has been used to cover up crimes up and down the line. You know, after 9/11, that the FBI was out to the Citgo station near the Pentagon within 15 minutes of the crash. Can you imagine them sitting around just waiting for a crash to occur and saying to themselves, boy, you know, if a crash happens, if a plane runs into the Pentagon, we're going to have to rush out to that Citgo station to get their footage. I mean, it's absurd. And in JFK, the FBI was used as the instrument of investigation, and you know, the Warren Commission and through the FBI didn't even question the 10 witnesses who were closest to the presidential limousine. And with others, if they knew they had important information, they didn't ask them questions that would elicit it, or if they by accident did, then they changed the testimony. I mean, it was really disgraceful. And here on
They should be called the FBC, Jim, the Federal Bureau of Cover-Ups, because, you know.
Well, I honestly believe that they spend more time covering up crimes committed by the government than they do in solving them. So in this case, Wellstone's plane went down about 10:20 in the morning on Friday, 25 October 2002, where he was flying from St. Paul to the Evelyn, Virginia airport so he could go to a funeral of a prominent Minnesota politician named Rukavina. And the assistant airport manager, a guy named Gary Ullman, noticed the plane was overdue. I mean, it had come in and it had clicked its microphone 7 times, whatever, which turns on the lights for the landing field to, you know, indicate that a plane's coming in. But when it didn't show up on time, he became concerned. And about 30 minutes later, he got in his plane, started flying around. He did see some whitish blue smoke off in the distance, but since jet fuel burns black, and you know, a turbojet runs on jet fuel, the same fuel that was alleged to have caused the Twin Towers to collapse, by the way. He looked around, but he couldn't find black smoke, so he came back to the bluish white smoke, which happens to be, by the way, indicative of an electrical fire, not a jet fuel fire. And there was the crash site. So he came down, picked up the fire department chief, and they flew back up. And, you know, he didn't identify the crash site until 11 o'clock. And then he took the fire chief up there so they could figure out how to get in, because it was in a wooded area kind of out of the way, 2 miles south of the airport. And yet, when Rick Wahlberg, the St. Louis County sheriff, arrived at the scene at 1:30. He saw members of the FBI Rapid Response Force from St. Paul on the scene, people he knew personally. And he asked them how long they'd been there, and they told him they'd been there since noon. I checked with Gary Ullman, and he said he'd been on the phone, so he didn't know exactly when they showed up, but it had been at least by 1 o'clock. And yet the FBI spokesman, McCabe by name, would claim that they hadn't actually shown up until 3:30. Well, that's a little consciousness of guilt at work there. I mean, I did a backward calculation. I mean, here you got this guy, McCabe, contradicting both the sheriff of St. Louis County and the airport assistant manager, who had absolutely no reason to lie. And they also appeared to be very authoritative sources, all things considered, especially since the sheriff knew some of these people personally. So I did a backwards calculation, using very conservative times, meaning getting them out of their office, get them to the airport very fast, into the plane very fast, taxiing, taking off very fast, flying to Duluth, renting cars, driving up to Evelyn, Virginia. And by my calculations, for them to have been there by noon, they had to have left St. Paul at the same time the senator's plane was taking off, namely about 9:30 in the morning, which is really displaying remarkable powers of prognostication to know they would have to be at a crash site before the crash had even taken place. Now, I'm quite convinced they were there to tidy things up, to cover it up, that if there are multiple indications that the plane was taken out using some kind of high-tech weapon, something that would create a surge of electricity that would overwhelm the computerized components of the plane, including the navigation aids, communication, this loud stall warning alarm, and also flip the switches, the solenoids that controlled the pitch of the props, onto idle. So the plane would have no forward thrust and would have to come down. More to come.
There you go, ladies and gentlemen. And there's still a ton more of evidence, and Jim's going to get into more when we come back on the other side of this break. Wellstone pissed off Cheney, by the way, just so you understand, ladies and gentlemen, because he was against invading Iraq. And Cheney threatened him. Ladies and gentlemen, we're back. Jim, I'm going to give you the floor. Just go ahead and pick up right where you got cut off by the break when you were getting into Wellstone.
Sure, Popeye. Well, one of the oddities of the FBI's early arrival was that by that evening, Paul McCabe, their spokesman, the same guy who'd claimed they only showed up at 3:30, contradicting both the county sheriff and also the airport assistant manager, would announce that the FBI had found no signs of terrorist involvement the evening of the crash. Now, what's startling about that is, you recall that the fuselage burned for 7 hours. It reduced all the contents to charcoal. They wouldn't even find the bodies until the next day when they were searching through the charcoal. They'd essentially been cremated. How could they possibly know that no terrorists had been involved when it would be a year before the NTSB would even make a determination about the cause of the crash? If you don't know the cause of the crash, how could you possibly know who might or might not have been in the position to have the means and the motive to bring about that cause of the crash? The situation was simply absurd. And in fact, Carol Carmody, who was in charge of the NTSB team, which showed up that evening but only appeared at the crash scene the next day, would repeat what Paul McCabe had said. But again, how could she or Paul McCabe possibly know? They couldn't. This would eventually have an ironic aspect to it, because it would turn out that the co-pilot, Michael Guess, actually had worked at a Pan Am in Minnesota, in Eden Prairie, and somehow his software he had on his computer for a Boeing 747 had wound up on the software of Zacharias Moussaoui, who was the alleged 20th hijacker. There's a long story involved with Moussaoui. The whole thing was a fantasy frame-up, where he was found guilty in 2005 of having been involved in the 2003 attempted bombing of the Twin Towers. But in 2004, they separated his trial for punishment by a year, and he was being retried for either receiving the death penalty or life in prison on the grounds that if he'd only come forward, he could have saved lives on 9/11. But you see, he wasn't found guilty of 9/11. So here you have the federal attorneys, the prosecutors, who have to know better, who are, trying to pin the tail for 9/11 on Moussaoui. He was a very cooperative, docile witness because he was equipped with a 10,000-volt stun belt. I'm sure that I would be very cooperative under those circumstances, but the whole thing was a charade. Now, the reason this is so fascinating, of course, is because not only does the FBI claim there's no indication of terrorist involvement when they couldn't possibly know, because no determination of the cause of the crash had yet occurred. This was already Friday night, the day of the crash. But it would turn out later, when they did this investigation, that there actually was a link to an alleged terrorist. So the whole situation was quite absurd. Now, Carol Carmody had also been in charge of the NTSB investigation of the death of Mel Carnahan, the former governor of Missouri, who was running for the United States Senate, who about 2 weeks before the election went down in a very odd plane crash in Missouri. I had a fellow who was a fanatic about capturing radar images who sent me some radar images, and it was very, very strange. I mean, you had this emanation of red pattern from the location where the crash had occurred, suggesting he was taken out by something highly unusual, probably also electromagnetic. And many of us have concluded that what happened with Wellstone was a refinement on the Carnahan operation. You know, I mean, what happened with the governor of Missouri said that if Carnahan were elected, even though he was deceased, that he'd appoint his wife to the Senate in his place, and the people of Missouri preferred to vote for a dead man to sending John Ashcroft back to the Senate. Well, in the case of Wellstone, they reduced the amount of time to about 10 days, and they made sure his wife was with him so she couldn't stand up for him. Took out him, his wife, his daughter, 3 of his aides, and the 2 pilots. Now, the NTSB only considered accident-compatible alternatives, the plane, the weather, or the pilots. Now, Wolf Blitzer, whom I think is one of those in the mass media that William Colby was talking about, was emphasizing how terrible the weather was. He was talking about freezing rain. He was talking about them closing the airport. He was talking about snowstorms, none of which was actually true, apart from closing the airport. In fact, he had a conversation with somebody saying, well, you know, they closed the airport. That's enough said, meaning as though it was just too dangerous, the conditions. But that's just a routine thing that the NTSB does when there's a crash related to an airport. They close it in order to determine whether or not there was anything about the airport that might have contributed to the crash. And in fact, there wasn't. There was a directional signal that was ever so slightly out of whack, but it had nothing to do with the crash. So Blitzer's exaggeration about the weather were very peculiar. In fact, we had an anchor in Duluth by the name of Denny Anderson, who was himself a pilot, who was correcting him every time Blitzer would come on and talk about how terrible the weather was. He'd correct and explain, no, the weather wasn't that bad. And in fact, it was rather clear. You'll even find photographs that were taken on the ground by a pilot who was in the immediate vicinity. If you go to this article of mine entitled Senator Paul Wellstone, More Proof of Assassination on Veterans Today, it was relatively clear, good visibility. There was not only no freezing rain, there wasn't even any rain. So the weather was just grossly exaggerated to try to create that first impression in the minds of the public that that's what happened. Bad weather, shouldn't have been flying in those conditions. In fact, other pilots had landed at the same airport earlier in the day with no problems whatsoever. So, you know, Wolf Blitzer was playing a role. He had a script and he was fulfilling it. And here was Denny Anderson valiantly trying to correct him each time. Well, we were there in Duluth. You know, we knew what the weather was like. This crash site was only 60 miles north of where I was. And we all knew the weather was just fine for that time of year. And, in fact, it wouldn't pose any problem for competent pilots. So then they talked about the plane. Well, the plane was a King Air A-100, which is like the Rolls-Royce of small aircraft. It has all kinds of sophisticated equipment, including, because this was a late model, it appears a sophisticated, you know, GPS system, so that it looks as though the pilots were going by their GPS, because they wound up coming in on the wrong azimuth. They were 6 or 8 degrees off course, but there was no distress calls, no signs that anything was wrong. And, in fact, a number of very unusual things happened around this time. At about 10:18, for example, a fellow named Ongaro, who was heading for the same funeral, who worked as a lobbyist for the city of Duluth, representing them in St. Paul with the state legislature. Paul Ongaro reported having a very odd cell phone experience. He got a call in, and when he went to answer it, he got this wailing, warbling, loud sound he'd never heard before. So he asked me if it could be related. I said, yes, would you please check your time? And he came back and said it was at 10:18. I checked with John Costello, the fellow I flew up from Australia, who told me that the wailing, warbling meant it was man-made, that, you know, and that there was no reason to think there was any source of electromagnetic field in that vicinity otherwise, so that it appeared to be that an artificial field had been set up so that when the plane flew into this electromagnetic field, that there would be consequences for the sophisticated electronic components of the plane.
Well, like an EMP blast. It would fry all the electronic equipment.
Yeah, except it's actually a field So that what happened was when Ongaro got the phone call, the phone acted as a receiver and simply received the electromagnetic pulses from the field that had been created, where luring the plane
that was spotted, right?
Yeah, I'll get to that. But this is so that when they lured the plane into the killing zone, rather like driving JFK into Dealey Plaza and taking that right on to Houston and left onto Elm Street, once they got him into the killing field. See, we have a school superintendent who actually heard popping sounds. He thought somebody might be firing a rifle to the plane, but actually what appears to have been going on was these different electrical components were popping in the plane from the overwhelming surge of energy, which also caused the props to feather down so that the plane was destined to crash from that point on. Now, just what effects may have occurred with the passengers is a somewhat of an open question, but could easily have rendered them unconscious or incapable of voluntary muscular control or even death. Now, some other signs, and the evidence I'm talking about now was not ever even identified by the NTSB, so that they performed one of the simplest fallacies possible, which is called special pleading. Only cite the evidence that's favorable to your side and exclude the rest. So it's not only this odd cell phone anomaly, there was not only these popping sounds, there was no distress call. Not only were they off course, not only was this fire that burns for 7 hours, and the only words in the entire NTSB report, which was about 80 pages long, was that there was a post-impact fire. But in fact, apparently there was enough remaining of one or another of the passengers that when I contacted the local coroner, he said there was smoke in the lungs. Some of the victims, which means it actually was a pre-impact fire, not a post-impact fire, which obviously would have grossly complicated the NTSB findings. Then it turns out there were garage doors that had opened that day without the owners, using their clickers, which would be
more evidence.
Yeah.
More evidence of this electromagnetic net. Jim, I got to cut you off for a second because you're about to get cut off. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with the final segment of tonight's edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. I thank you all for listening. And in the few minutes we have left here, we have about 10 minutes. Jim's going to tie everything up for you. He's going to explain a little bit more about Wellstone, and he's going to tie it all up and explain how why Paul Wellstone's death and Pat Tillman's death, some of the evidence, there is enough evidence, obviously, to postulate and on the fact that they were both killed and assassinated. Now, who would have benefited from that? And I would say, look at the people that were in charge at the time and who push the cover-up and everything else. And when I say evidence, obviously there's not enough evidence. There's not enough time in 2 hours, right, Jim, to put all the evidence out on the table. But Jim's done a really good job. So I'm going to give him the floor. And, Jim, you have the remaining time, my friend. Go ahead.
Well, having discovered that the weather was perfectly reasonable, as the NTSB would finally admit, and that the plane was the Rolls-Royce of small aircraft and had no maintenance problems at all. It practically flies itself. And they turned their attention to the pilots and held them at fault, allegedly for having lost track of their airspeed and altitude and simply letting the plane to crash. Now, this is rather preposterous. The chief pilot, the pilot of the plane, whose name was Richard Connery, had 5,200 hours of experience. He had an air transport pilot certification, which is the second highest short of astronaut. And he'd passed his FAA flight check with an instructor from the government in the plane with him just 2 days before the fatal flight. So this guy was extremely competent. The plane didn't require two pilots, but Michael Guess was with him too. He was a competent pilot, not as distinguished as Connery. In fact, Paul Wellstone didn't like to fly, preferred to fly with Connery because he trusted him. Later, after the crash, complaints would be made that Connery was careless and so forth. But the chief pilot said that he'd never heard any of these complaints before the crash. And in fact, another pilot who had co-piloted with him on 50 different occasions, 50 times, said that Connery was the most meticulous and conscientious pilot with whom he'd ever flown. I have a friend in Minneapolis who actually went to high school with Connery and explained to me he was obsessive compulsive, and he would have been an extremely meticulous pilot. So I don't think this goes anywhere. And when you stop and think about it seriously, the idea that two competent pilots would have lost track of their airspeed and altitude and simply let the plane crash is quite fantastic. I mean, suppose at one time in 1,000, a pilot might lose track of their airspeed, or one time in 1,000 of their altitude. We're only talking about an event happening together one time in 1,000,000. And there was this loud air stall alarm, throw in another 1,000, and you got one in 1,000,000,000,000. And any way you want to cut it, I mean, if you said one time in 100, if one time in 100 a pilot would lose track of his airspeed and altitude, an altitude 1 in 100, then that's one time in 10,000. And if you add another, 3 zeros, you're getting into 10 million, one time in 10 million. Well, that's fantastic. And there were two pilots. So if it's whether it's 1 in 1,000,000 or 1 in 1 in 10 million or a larger number, they have to be multiplied times itself twice to get the improbability of this actually happening. I mean, what pilot is going to ignore his loud stall warning alarm, for example? And when they're flying with a senator, obviously you're going to be especially prudent. They appear to have been drawn off course by messing with the GPS so that they didn't realize they were off course. And a friend of mine who's very experienced in this area has told me that's relatively easy to do, and that it could have been done with this white van that was seen fleeing the area at high speed, a highly unusual event, by the way, in that area, by Rodney Allen, who actually witnessed it. He'd actually seen the plane, too, just barely, missing the treetops as it was trying to get somewhere, probably already no longer under the control of the pilot. So when you put all the evidence together, the whole scenario that the pilots were responsible is fantastic, and the only way they can justify it is by ignoring that it could have been a small bomb or a gas canister or some kind of high-tech weapon. In fact, it turns out that I heard from a pilot who was flying in the opposite direction, flying east toward Waukegan Airport, and who landed at Waukegan Airport at the same time that the Wellstone plane crashed at 10:20, and who told me that for the first time in his experience, the GPS degrade light had come on in his plane, and when he got out of the clouds, he discovered he was south of his intended azimuth as well. So it was like the mirror image of what was happening to Paul Wellstone. So there's, a considerable reason to believe that they were messing with the GPS, at least on a local level, but sufficient to affect the planes going in both directions. Now, not only that, but when I brought John Costello back up from Australia, he and I, principally he, went through the 2,500 pages of supporting documents and records that the official NTSB report, which was only about 80 pages, was allegedly based on. And John came across an odd meteorological phenomenon, which is at the level where ice forms above the crash site, there was a large melted area, water instead of ice, which the meteorologists couldn't explain, but which would be a predictable outcome of the use of a directed energy weapon of the kind we believe was involved. It's very interesting that Michael Rupert, in his book Crossing the Rubicon, arrived at the same conclusion that we did about the use of a directed energy weapon, and also had been contacted by somebody in the business who was involved in wet work for the agency, who told him that it had been a deliberate hit, that a group of reinvigorated old white guys were in charge, and they were no one to screw around with. And he was talking about Cheney and Rumsfeld and their cronies. And that you could expect there would be other strategic accidents like this in the future. So that's a kind of more direct confirmation than you'd expect. But what is the probability that the NTSB was right, that it was merely an accident, these guys lost track of their airspeed and altitude? Incredibly small. On the other hand, if you assume that this was done using some kind of creating a directed energy field, then you're going to be able to explain the anomalous phone call. You're going to be able to explain the garage doors open. You're going to be able to explain the sounds of shots in the plane. In fact, the independent company that studied the props explained they had been on idle, and it was inexplicable. The NTSB could never explain it, but it would have occurred had the sequence of events I've been describing taken place. Popeye mentioned before that Wellstone had been threatened by Cheney. Indeed, in Wilmer, Minnesota, not long before his death, he explained he just had a meeting with Cheney, and Cheney told him that if he opposed them on Iraq, that there would be severe ramifications for him personally and for the state of Minnesota. Well, what could be more severe than taking him out and removing this inspiring, courageous voice who is known as the conscience of the Senate, who is speaking out and criticizing their plan to invade Iraq. In fact, when Wellstone made his speech to the Senate, he was apprehensive it was going to represent the end of his career. In fact, the people of Minnesota responded positively, and by the time of his death, he was 6, 7, 8 points and growing on Norm Coleman, who was the handpicked candidate of Karl Rove and the Bush machine, which was about to expect a severe disruption. There were even articles, it was well known that he was the principal target, that the Bush people wanted to take him out, that, they talked about terminating him, presumably that meant politically rather than literally, but there's a massive evidence that substantiates it. A guy named Michael Neiman at a New York State campus was immediately speculating he'd been taken out before I had even undertaken the scientific study of this case. And so there was a convergence and conclusion, and then you got Michael Rupert arriving at the very same opinion. I mean, this guy was charismatic, outspoken, and he would have been inspiring to Democrats all over the country. He might even have run for president. If you want to learn more, you can go to Senator Paul Wellstone, More Proof of Assassination on Veterans Today, and I've included there a lecture, one of the last I gave at UMD before I retired in June of 2006. I gave a three-parter, three hours of lectures, an hour on JFK, an hour on 9/11, and an hour on Wellstone. And the lecture on Wellstone you can find there. It's a very nice distilled summary. For those who want to learn more of my work about 9/11 or Wellstone or Tillman, just go to Veterans Today, Jim Fetzer, and you get an index to what maybe 30 articles there now. I also have radio interviews where I have more than 400 two-hour interviews on a whole host of subjects at radiofetzer.blogspot.com. So you can have access to them. And then, of course, I'm the founder of Scholars for 9/11 Truth, and you can learn more about our research on 9/11 and some of my most recent presentations there at 911scholars.org. I also have a public issues website that has a lot about JFK, 9/11, and Wellstone at assassinationscience.com. And Popeye, I'm just very appreciative to you for having me on the show because I think these are vital issues. I mean, if the administration is taking out its political opponents, the ones that are the most popular and charismatic, as we saw in the 60s with the assassinations of JFK and Martin Luther King and Bobby, the people really no longer have the opportunity to select the leaders that they prefer. Democracy becomes meaningless because essentially the leadership of the opposing party has been decapitated. And I think this is another illustration in the case of Paul Wellstone. The Pat Tillman case, I think it's fairly obvious that they were very worried that an anti-war, a macho NFL football player, widely admired, would return to the United States to spearhead an anti-war movement, which he'd actually lived through.
I agree.
Positive motive enough for them to take him out, I'm sorry to say.
I agree 100%. Jim, we are out of time. Thank you for coming on, my friend. It is always a pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening. I'll be back again Friday on my show, and I'll be guest hosting the Bob Tuskin Radio Show tomorrow. So tune in.
That Pat Tillman committed a colossal mistake. He couldn't possibly have realized at the time. But a friend arranged for him to go to visit Noam Chomsky, who, of course, many on the left regard as something of an idol, if not a living god. And that Chomsky, see, by confiding in Chomsky, he was disillusioned with the war, and that he wanted to become an anti-war activist when he returned. Would have been a good thing if Chomsky was on the up and up. My suspicion, however, based upon my experience with him and what I know about him in relation to JFK on the one hand and 9/11 on the other, is that while Chomsky is very good at the intermediate level issues that ultimately don't make a great deal of difference when it comes to the big ticket issues, whether JFK's assassination involved a conspiracy, high-level government officials, whether 9/11 was a fabricated event involving Bush, Cheney, neocons, and the Mossad. He's an utter failure. He's an utter failure, Popeye.
I agree. I agree, Jim. We're going to get cut off by the break. But I agree with what you're saying. From what I've researched on Chomsky, he's not on the up and up. And there's a lot of other people that have said the same thing. So you're not alone. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be right back. Stay tuned. More on the murder Corporal Pat Tillman. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back. This is my friend LMS. You guys should check him out. He's on iTunes. Good guy. Founding member of Federal Jack. He's supported me for a long, long time. Really good guy, good friend of mine. Giving you a shout out, L. All right, anyway, getting back into it. Jim and I were talking about, Pat Tillman and going into the break, and we were discussing, Jim was breaking down scientific method and everything, and once you look at it using certain principles and you look at the Tillman murder, using the scientific method, you realize that the probability of, an accidental shooting is, and then all these things covering it up afterwards is just, a bazillion to one. And, Jim, I find that that's usually how they get caught, is not even so much in pulling the act off, because obviously they've thought about the act itself and many times figured out ways to cover it and make, things confusing, the act itself. But it's the cover-up that they do afterwards that sticks out like a sore thumb.
Well, it depends. Yeah, it depends how much time and effort is devoted to designing it. In the case of JFK, that doesn't have much thought put into it. The Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, that doesn't have much thought. But 9/11 and JFK, they have more thought put into it. So you're right. It depends on the amount of time they have. If they just have time to slap something together, or if they actually have time to rehearse it. Yeah. But I find that.com. And today I have a special show planned for you all. I have a good friend of mine and frequent guest to the program here, back on, Professor Jim Fetzer. Jim, say hello. Hey, Popeye.
And Jim's been kind enough to grace us with his knowledge this evening, even though he's a little under the weather. So everybody has to, give him a break for his sore throat. But Jim came on tonight because we're going to talk about two murders. One we've already talked about a little bit, but we're going to get back into it. And another one Jim just wrote an article about, which I reposted over on Federal Jack. And it's gone viral off of my site. And I'm sure the original that he posted on Veterans Today is probably gone viral as well. And it's about the murder of Corporal Pat Tillman. Jim, what do you want to get into first? Do you want to discuss Paul Wellstone, or do you want to discuss Tillman and then show how that dovetails into Wellstone?
Well, Popeye, the principles of reasoning are the same, so that might be the place to begin. It's the basic principle of scientific reasoning that enables you to sort these things out is called inference to the best explanation. So what you're doing when you compare alternative hypotheses, in this case we're talking about whether Pat Tillman was killed by accident during a firefight, or whether he may have been deliberately assassinated. And what you want to look at is all of the evidence and ask, well, which is more probable for all that evidence to be the case, that he was assassinated or that it was a firefight? I mean, let me mention just a couple of key points here. No evidence of enemy fire at the scene has ever been produced. The lieutenant general who withheld details of Tillman's death from his parents for months told investigators that he had a bad memory, he couldn't remember details of his actions on more than 70 occasions. According to the Washington Post on May 4, 2005, the Army's own investigators were aware that Tillman had been killed by being shot 3 times in the head. Senior Army commanders, including General John Abizay, knew of this fact within days of the shooting, but nevertheless approved him for the Silver Star, the Purple Heart, and a posthumous promotion. Army doctors told the investigators that these tightly grouped wounds suggested murder and urged them to launch a criminal investigation, which would not be pursued. And Army attorneys congratulated each other in emails for impeding any criminal investigation, as they concluded that Tillman's death was the result of friendly fire and that only administrative or non-criminal punishment was indicated, and indeed, no one was ever punished for this case. Now, compare this to a very simple illustration of what I'm talking about. Suppose you find a body, and it has no knife wounds and no gun.
that cover-up or the investigation thereinto, you know what I mean? Because there always has to be, when something happens, you wait to see their reaction. Look at the BP oil spill. If anybody wants to think, if you don't think that the oil spill was created or done as a criminal act, the response to it was certainly criminal. So obviously something is there. You know what I mean? If they really gave a crap, they wouldn't have reacted that way. So I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead, Jim. The floor is yours.
Oh, no. Actually, I was going to agree with you that in particular it's unpacking the cover-up that provides the greatest evidence as to who was responsible. I mean, in the case of JFK, for example, we discovered that the autopsy x-rays had been altered to conceal a massive blowout to the back of the head, which had been fired by a shot from the right front. That once they patched up that hole in the back of the head, there was nowhere for his brains to have gone. So even though he had a third to a half of his brains blown out in Dealey Plaza, they substituted someone else's brain for his, which you can find in diagrams and photographs in the National Archives, which led a world authority on the human brain, Bob Livingston, to recognize that this couldn't possibly be JFK's brains, because so many physicians at Parkland Hospital had talked about cerebellar as well as cerebral tissue extruding from the fist-sized hole at the back of his head, where the cerebellum is a compact part of the brain at the base of the skull, which he, by the way, believed could not have been dislodged even by two near simultaneous shots, one to the back of his head and the other that entered his right temple, which was a frangible or exploding bullet, unless this tough membrane that covers the cerebellum, called the tentorium, had itself been ruptured, which led him to infer that the bullet that hit Jack in the throat had hit bone and split, part of it gone down into the right lung, the other upward to sever the tentorium, so that there would be the possibility of cerebellum extruding from the near simultaneous impact of those other two shots. And then third, of course, that the whole movie of the assassination, in fact, all of them, the three or four key ones that show the most important elements of the assassination, have been altered to take out, in particular, a limo stop. The driver, William Greer, pulled the limousine to the left and to a halt to make sure Jack would be killed, and it was during that, say, 3-second approximately interval that he was hit twice in the head, fell forward. Jack eased him back up and was looking at him right in the face when he was hit by a frangible or exploding bullet in the right temple that set up shock waves that blew his brains out the back of his head so hard that the motorcycle patrolman to the left rear, Bobby Hargis, impacted with that debris, thought he himself had been shot, and where a triangular chunk of the back of Jack's head was found in the grass the next day. Now, you have to ask, who would have the power to do that?
Jackie was going after, right? A lot of people thought that she was climbing out of the back of the limo. That's not what she was doing.
Either we heal as a team, or we're going to crumble. Inch by inch, play by play, till we're finished. We're in hell right now, gentlemen, believe me. And we can stay here, get the shit kicked out of us, or we can fight our way back into the light. We can climb out of hell, 1 inch at a time. You know, when you get old in life, things get taken from you. I mean, that's part of life. But you only learn that when you start losing stuff. You find out life's this game of inches. So is football. Because in either game, life or football, the margin for error is so small. I mean, 1/2 a step too late or too early, and you don't quite make it. 1/2 second too slow, too fast, you don't quite catch it. The inches we need are everywhere around us. They're in every break of the game, every minute, every second. On this team, we fight for that inch. On this team, we tear ourselves and everyone else around us to pieces for that inch. We claw our fingernails for that inch. Because we know when we add up all those inches, that's going to make the fucking difference between winning and losing. Between living and dying. It's the guy who's willing to die who's going to win that inch. And I know if I'm going to have any life anymore, it's because I'm still willing to fight and die for that inch. Because that's what living is. There's 6 inches in front of your face. Now, I can't make you do it. You got to look at the guy next to you. Look into his eyes. Now, I think you're going to see a guy who will go that inch with you. You're going to see a guy who will sacrifice himself for this team because he knows when it comes down to it, you're going to do the same for him. That's a team, gentlemen. And either we heal now as a team, or we will die as individuals.
Ideas are bulletproof.
Welcome to the show, ladies and gentlemen. It is December 28th, 2011. This is another live edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. I'm your host, Popeye from Federal Jack.
Shot wounds, but it has, say, some bruising around the neck. Then if you're a detective investigating the case, you might consider whether the deceased was shot, or was stabbed, or was strangled. Well, since there was no bullet wounds in the body, the probability that this person was shot is approximately 0. Similarly, since there are no knife wounds in the body, the probability that he was killed by being stabbed is also approximately 0. But given abrasions around the throat, the probability that he might have been strangled would be considerably higher. Now, that means at that point that what's known as the likelihood or measure of evidential support, which is based on those probabilities, provides stronger support for the hypothesis that the decedent was strangled than that he was shot or that he was stabbed. Now, that makes it what is known as the preferable hypothesis. It's like having a strongest suspect in a murder case based upon the then available evidence. Now,
well, when we apply that to Pat Tillman's death, it doesn't point towards blue on blue friendly fire at all, does it?
It doesn't. No, it doesn't. So I ask, see, this is what I ask further on down. I say, here we compare H1 that it was an accident and H2 that it was not as follows. H1, if Tillman had been killed accidentally, even by friendly fire, then what is the probability that no evidence of a bona fide firefight would be produced, that the lieutenant general would suffer 70 memory lapses, that the corporal would have been shot 3 times in the head, that honors would be bestowed upon him, that the doctors would have suspected he was murdered, and that Army attorneys would impede criminal investigations? The likelihood of this evidence, given that it was an accident, would have been very low. But H2, if Tillman had been killed intentionally using friendly fire as the cover story, then what's the probability that no evidence of a bona fide firefight would be produced, that the lieutenant general would suffer 70 memory lapses, that the corporal would have been shot 3 times in the head, that honors would be bestowed upon him, that the doctors would have suspected he was murdered, and that Army attorneys would impede criminal investigations? The likelihood of this evidence, given it was intentional, would have been very high. So you don't actually have to be a rocket scientist to realize something is wrong here, that the Army's claim is preposterous on its face.
Yeah, and McChrystal, he got pretty much outed for lying about the whole thing, and he still didn't get in any trouble. I mean, getting fired by Obama was a complete different thing. That was over a separate issue that had nothing to do with the Tillman incident.
That's right. My impression is that McChrystal was actually fairly enthusiastic about assassinations and other forms of subversive warfare. So, this was really bad. And I believe, as I explain in the article to which you make reference,